About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the joint staff who had used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They've just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
Joining me now to talk about this is former Pentagon official Michael Maloof, who's been looking into what the United States' next play is. Why does Iran come to this conversation suddenly?
Well, the question is going to be what happens to those troops that are being withdrawn from Syria and Afghanistan. They're going into Iraq. And if you'll recall President Trump's speech on New Year's Eve to the troops, he talked about how the troops are going to remain. They're going to be there to spring into Syria if necessary. But then he said, and Iran, to watch Iran. Why are you going to send special forces troops into Iran? Well, it's something being planned. The one thing I would watch out for is he going to be withdrawing any troops also from South Korea in this time frame? So you got to keep in mind.
You're talking almost about a consolidation of troops. I mean, if you take a bunch out of Syria, you take a bunch out of Afghanistan, take a bunch out of, as you mentioned, part of South Korea. My God, you got a lot of troops.
This is speculation, but Iraq could become the new hub for U.S. Middle East policy.
Iraq,
for the positioning of these troops. And this is sort of a continuation from John Bolton's activities from 2003.
Well, hold on a minute. When you say Iraq, I'm a little confused. Do you mean Iraq as a launching point to possibly engage Iran?
Yes.
Because it's right next door.
That's correct.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned John Bolton. This is interesting that you would mention him because Trump has been saying all along, and he campaigned on the promise, and we know that not everything Donald Trump campaigns on actually comes to fruition, but let us just say that Donald Trump was true when he said the first thing I want to do is get out of these unnecessary wars. It's about America first. Let's stop taking care of everybody else's business, et cetera, et cetera. But there seems to be a change in this administration. Who's driving this?
There's a Trump foreign policy and a Trump administration foreign policy, and the neocons have basically taken over Trump's foreign policy.
You're talking about your friend John Bolton?
He's not my friend, but yes.
You've spoken to John Bolton?
Yes.
What have you learned when you've spoken to John Bolton in the past?
Well, in 2003, I briefed him when he was the Undersecretary of State, ostensibly on terrorism. However, his vision for that region was we were going to take Baghdad first, then use that as a springboard to take Damascus, Tehran, Libya, and then Saudi Arabia. All the countries at that time which were regarded as enemies of Israel.
Bolton has always been known as a guy who no war is enough. I mean, if I hope I'm not overstating this, but he's definitely a hot.
Well, he's never been in the military. He's never been in a war. I've been associated with at least 2 wars, and that's the last thing in the world we want.
But he seems to be, he was the biggest proponent of the war in Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, and you think good betting money would say he would probably be one of the biggest proponents of the war, of a war in Iran.
Yeah, he's been meeting very recently in Albania, for example, with MEK, which is the opposition, one of the many opposition groups of Iran. They want the administration to go on into Iran.
It has failed domestically in economics and politics. Indeed, its time of weakening is only accelerating, and that's why the changed circumstances in the United States, I think throughout Europe, and here today are so important. There is a viable opposition to the rule of the Ayatollahs, and that opposition is centered in this room today. I had said for over 10 years since coming to these events that the declared policy of the United States of America should be the overthrow of the mullahs regime in Tehran. The behavior and the objectives of the regime are not going to change, and therefore the only solution is to change the regime itself.
And I want to tell you, the changes in Washington are very exciting. You saw on this stage, standing here, of course in Paris, but this reminds me of Paris, you saw John Bolton. You remember John Bolton. He's going to be President Trump's national security advisor. You think he changed his mind? No, in fact, if anything, John Bolton has become more determined that there needs to be regime change in Iran, that the nuclear agreement needs to be burned, and that you need to be in charge of that country with Democratic allies and even Democratic opponents. That's what we want. That's democracy. There's a Republican and a Democratic Party in America. There's several parties in Albania. They don't all agree with each other. That's what democracy is about. That's what you want. You'll rule, others will rule over a period of time. And that's what makes a great country. And that allows your children to have the freedom that you haven't had. And I have so much respect for you because your sacrifice is making all this possible. And the right policy for Iran, for every good, decent government in the world, is regime change. Regime change. Regime change, absolutely. Let him hear it. Let him hear it in Tehran. You know they're nervous. You know they're nervous. You know they're frightened. Bullies are always frightened when someone stands up to them, and you've stood up to them. So I look forward to coming back here. I look forward to our meetings in Paris and in Washington, and anywhere that you need me, I'm there. But I'm going to conclude with telling you there's one place I want to go. There's only one place that will make me happier than being here in Toronto with you. And you know where that is, Tehran! Thank you.
Because we're talking about this. Let me just ask you, is John Bolton a really smart, measured guy or not?
He's smart, but he's calculating. And this whole thing is what the withdrawals and what have you. I think he's manipulating the president at this point, and I think that what we're seeing is something in which John Bolton is planning something bigger, and he's working in cahoots with Netanyahu.
This is great insight. Thank you, Michael. As usual, well done. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, was very unhappy with the U.S. pull-out of Syria, thinking that it was an impediment to Iran coming to the Mediterranean. Well, they're already there. The reality is that he's doing more provocations now, just in Syria, just in recent days, over Lebanon. I think things are brewing, and I think that Trump will be using these troops ultimately for something bigger in Iran, potentially against Iran at the beginning, maybe just after the beginning of the year.
Is that the logic behind all this? Because I can't figure out why, you know, with everybody on both sides of the aisle seeming to be against the move, And I've heard silence from people like John Bolton, who I imagine is not happy with this, and of course Mattis resigned over it. I'm trying to figure out what's the method to the madness. It can't be the conversation with the Turkish president who said get out, and he said, sure, I'll get out, good idea. There has to be more to it, right?
Of course there is, but he's not going to telegraph his moves, just like the pull out of Syria. He didn't telegraph that at all. Caught everybody by surprise. The fact that Bolton is quiet, I think, is problematic. I think that it's going to be one in which we're going to, in which he's got to placate not only Netanyahu but Bolton, and Iran seems to be the target.
Okay.
Some people say, well, maybe somebody comes from the area and they hit us on our homeland. If that happens, they will suffer consequences over here like nobody has ever suffered before. Let me just tell you, and I hope they hear that loud and clear, and that's not a threat, that's going to be a fact. And that's not a threat, that's going to be a fact. And that's not a threat, that's going to be a fact.
So, what's Plan B?
The United States and the international community are determined to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons.
The US military have had plans really since the fall of the Shah for military action.
Cyber warfare is stage one. Stage two, in the military sense, would be massive ordnance air blast bombs, or the MOAB, mother of all bombs. This is the most powerful traditional military non-nuclear bomb that the US has in their arsenal. There are also a new generation of bunker busters.
An American strike would be neither limited nor surgical.
A massive American attack on Iran would be able to attack some 10,000 different aim points, more or less overnight.
Their plans would destroy all Iranian air and sea bases and hit all known nuclear facilities. Iran would be left in flames.
The Americans would claim these were surgical strikes, although I'm sure there would be very, very considerable casualties, of course, but mostly off camera.
If the US or Israel hit a nuclear reactor that is going at full steam, you have potential of a giant, dirty bomb, and then the civilian deaths could be in the hundreds of thousands.
This conflict, with estimates of between 1 and 2 million Iranian civilians dead, could get out of hand.
You got to be careful of unintended consequences here.
Best laid plans of mice and men don't always come to fruition. Chaos theory can come into play. This is uncharted territory for both America and Israel.
After such a massive offensive, Iran would fire everything it had left towards Israel. It would launch wave after wave of attacks against Western targets in Iraq and Afghanistan, and damage ports and oil refineries in the Gulf. The US would ask its NATO allies for support, dragging Turkey and the two nuclear powers, Russia and China, reluctantly into the conflagration.
After the first stage of an attack on Iran, this could balkanize the global geopolitical scene into a new Cold War scenario.
The consequences for the world as a whole are a terrible return to 19th century power politics, which of course produced the First World War.
The result could be apocalyptic. A new wave of global violence could follow, and soaring oil prices would be the final blow to a global economy in chaos. Are such doomsday scenarios bluff, psychological warfare? Or is the world really prepared to go this far?